My name is Jim. I'm a musician in Nashville, and I'm pretty sure I've figured out the one thing every influential guitar tone has in common. About a year ago, I was confused by all the conflicting opinions out there about guitar tone, so I started from scratch and tested a bunch of things myself. And whenever I'd talk to my friends about the tests I was doing, I kept getting asked, but what does it sound like in the room? So I thought about that question. Since I was 13, I've been plugging guitars into amps in rooms and playing. And sometimes I'd learn an influential player's part note for note and still sound nothing like it because my tone was different from the influential player's tone. So I tried to learn more. I started reading magazine articles where people talked about tone, and going to forum sites where people talked about tone, and watching YouTube videos where people talked about tone. And I ended up in a horrible cycle of not sounding like I wanted, finding out about different pieces of gear that would add clarity or punch or warmth or fullness to my tone, selling stuff to get it, and I would still have moments where I felt like my tone was good and moments where I felt like my tone was bad. Even if it was the same guitar through the same pedals into the same amp, with all the knobs in the same spots, the sound I was hearing in the room sometimes made me happy and sometimes didn't make me happy. So I had to zoom way out, clear my mind of every preconceived notion I had, and ask myself a very simple but very important question. What do I think is good guitar tone, and how did that tone get made? Everybody has their favorite guitar tones that made them want to start playing or inspired them to keep playing. So let's name those. What were those actually? If someone asks me what my favorite guitar tone is, I'm not going to say a 100-watt Plexi Marshall, or a vintage Blackguard Telly, or any other inanimate physical object. I'm going to say JT Corenflos' guitar parts on the Long Trip Alone album, or the Brad Paisley song Cliffs of Rock City, or the outro solo of Stupid Boy by Keith Urban. My favorite guitar tones aren't objects I've read about, they're sounds I've heard. In fact, when I think about it, all of my favorite guitar tones I've ever heard throughout my life, whether I heard them on the radio, or TV, or vinyl, or cassette, or CD, or iPod, or Spotify, or YouTube, all of those tones were recorded. That's how I was able to hear them. So all of those amps, quiet or loud in the room at the time, were mic'd, then went through a preamp that was turned up or down to compensate, then mixed on faders to balance with everything else. If the amp was quiet, the preamp or faders went up. If the amp was loud, the preamp or faders went down. The original volume of the amp in the room was corrected for and made irrelevant, twice. And it was only the tone coming from the amp through the microphone that I ever got to hear. But not live shows, right? Actually, yes, live shows too. I am, along with most living people, young enough that every concert I've been to had a PA system with the guitar going through it, meaning all of those amps, quiet or loud in the room at the time, were mic'd, went through a preamp that was turned up or down to compensate, then mixed on faders to balance with everything else. If the amp was quiet, the preamp or faders went up. If the amp was loud, the preamp or faders went down. The original volume of the amp in the room was corrected for and made irrelevant, twice. And it was only the tone coming from the amp through the microphone that I ever got to hear. Everything I've loved that has ever hit my ears was the tone the microphone picked up from the guitar amp. Everything any of us has loved that has ever hit any of our ears was the tone the microphone picked up from the guitar amp. But you might be thinking, if every tone anyone has ever loved was on radio or TV or vinyl or cassette or CD or iPod or Spotify or YouTube or the memory of a live show, and all of those tones went through a microphone, then that would mean that an electric guitar's sound in the room doesn't matter. And you're right. An electric guitar's sound in the room doesn't matter. That isn't what we hear, and that isn't what we've ever heard. Unless your favorite tones came from across the floor at Guitar Center, an electric guitar's sound in the room not only doesn't matter, it can't matter. You don't even have the ability to care how my Anderson Telly sounds through my vintage Fender in my bedroom or basement because I can't show you unless I record it through a microphone. If you disagree, send me your favorite unrecorded guitar tone. So this is what my guitar tone sounds like in the room. And this is what my guitar tone sounds like when recorded with a microphone. If it isn't recorded, it doesn't exist. This fundamental misunderstanding about guitar tone is why I was chasing my tail for such a long time. I was trying to magically make the tone that came out of the amp and hit my ears wherever I was in the room sound as good as the tone in a recording I liked, or worse, in my memory of a recording I liked. And when I'd play, my opinion of my tone wasn't objective. Without even realizing it, my opinion of my tone depended on where the amp was set up, where I was standing, which way my head was facing, if I was moving around, what I had to eat that day, what my last interaction with a girl was like. But I didn't do anything to actually evaluate and be responsible for what sound was coming from my gear and going through the mic, the sound everyone else was hearing me make. So I changed. Instead of leaning on my arbitrary experience with gear, I started recording A/B tests, and I could listen to a before and after back to back with no gap and see how different a piece of gear was from what I already had. And a lot of what I heard in these tests went against what I thought common knowledge was. But what I heard was real. I had audio proof that that's what it really sounds like when you do that. It made me realize that the power to easily A/B test two things at home is a relatively new thing, and pioneers of the guitar gear industry probably didn't have tape machines or ADAT machines right at their workbench. They were probably kind of like me as a kid, where my opinion of something, like guitar strings for example, was formed by having a set of strings on my guitar, playing them, changing them, then playing the new strings and comparing how the new strings sounded to my memory of how the old strings used to sound. And since then, I've figured out that I can't accurately remember how something sounds much longer than about 5 seconds. And it takes a lot longer than 5 seconds to change strings, or tubes, or pickups, or speakers, or do almost anything. So I started doing the work and building up a library of A/B tests and making videos that just explained what I did and then showed the audio and put them on YouTube for anybody to watch and listen to. But even still, some of my friends will watch one of my videos and say, "Cool, but YouTube compression mangles the audio quality, so I can't tell what the tone actually sounds like." And this would be a very serious problem. If YouTube compression mangles the audio to the point where people can't tell what the things I do actually sound like, then that would undercut everything I've been doing. I have spent a lot of time working with the uncompressed audio, and I always watched the video on YouTube before hitting publish, and I never noticed my audio being mangled. I do remember reading about how YouTube converts audio to AAC format, which uses perceptual encoding that splits the audio into separate frequency bands and for any given chunk of time assigns an appropriately sized bit rate to each frequency band, prioritizing info that will be audible and spending fewer resources on info that won't be audible because of the phenomenon where our basilar membrane is curled up inside our cochlea and senses frequencies from high to low as you go deeper into the spiral, and when part of the membrane vibrates from a loud sound, the areas directly around it become less sensitive to softer sounds, so the perceived sound quality would be minimally affected if the nearby frequency bands with the soft sounds were allotted fewer bits than the frequency bands of the loud sounds in the time frames when the loud sounds were occurring. But I might be remembering that wrong, and all of that is just words anyway. And even if the words sound smart, when the subject is audio, the only evidence that matters is audio. And I can't show you uncompressed audio in this video because this is itself a YouTube video. But I can put a bunch of comparisons of uncompressed versus compressed audio on a page of my website, where I have another video that guides you through what everything is so you can listen and decide for yourself how much YouTube compression actually mangles the audio. But I'll bet you $10 off my IR pack you don't actually go there and do that. But Jim, what about room mics? Right, so I'm lucky enough to be friends with the guy that mixed my favorite music, and I have first-hand evidence that on that particular music, any electric guitar parts during tracking or overdubs were close mic'd only.
The signal chain for JT, I mean, it was literally a 57 into the Neve, 2 tape. That was it.
And any space heard on the electric guitar in the final masters came from either the player's delay pedal into the front of the amp or a small amount of the guitar track being sent to Avid Revibe at one of these 3 settings during mixing.
A lot of those records, I would find a plate just to make everyone in the same room, something to just add a little bit of ambience in the track, but the tone, that was pretty much just what he laid down.
And close miking dry with reverb and mixing is how I've usually seen it done, but I'm kind of young and haven't been around for most of recorded music history. Maybe close mics are a modern thing and it used to be done differently. So I called someone who has been around for most of recorded music history, Wayne Moss, a session guitar player who started in the 50s and played electric guitar on Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison and Only Daddy That'll Walk the Line by Waylon Jennings. Maybe he would know where the mic was put back then.
Oh,
Hey, is this Wayne?
yes.
Hey Wayne, my name is Jim, and I'm trying to get a sense of history of how guitar sounds have been made throughout the years. I'm not too interested in pedals and stuff. I'm more interested in like the microphones and where they were placed. Do you put it right up on the amp, or do you back it off and use room mics?
If you got a room full of people, it'll bleed into everyone else. So you use at a low level and put the microphone close. It ain't rocket science.
Is that how it was back in like 50s and 60s when you were starting out too, or did they do stuff different back then when they had fewer tracks to go to?
That's how we did it, starting in the 50s and 60s, yes.
So this is what close miking sounds like. And this is what room miking sounds like. I think close miking is the main sound I've heard on most of the music I like, but I've read that some players have had room mics blended in with the close mics as an effect to give it some space. Whereas other people use a delay pedal for space, or the built-in spring reverb on their amp for space, or a reverb chamber, plate, rack unit, or plug-in later on for space. So there's a chance that room mics were used for the electric guitars on your favorite music. I know that if it happened on my favorite music, I'd be taking room mics and moving them around and listening to the different tones I could get, recorded through the microphones, not positioning my head in the one spot of the room where I sound like I want, then making anyone listening to me stand right there. Yes. Corey, come in here.
Yeah.
Stand right here.
Okay.
All right. Do I sound like John Mayer?
I'm not hearing it.
Get on your tiptoes, I'm taller than you.
Yes, you sound like John Mayer.
But Jim, what about going direct? Yeah, some influential guitar tones, mostly from the 80s and 90s, were DI.
Bowen wanted us to not use amplifiers.
Neon Moon.
That was direct.
Meet in the Middle was a direct guitar sound.
Meaning no amp, meaning no speaker, so in those cases, there were no mics. Because why would there be mics when there was also no in-the-room sound to begin with? Those players only heard the sound sent back into their headphones from the console. The same idea could apply to people who record with modelers. Taking all of this info in and thinking about it, it seems like the only way the in-the-room sound could matter is if it could somehow change the tone coming out of the guitar itself. And some of my friends say that it does. They say that the tone of the guitar itself will change if it's in the presence of a loud amp making the guitar vibrate differently. But how would you even test something like that?
A little bit. Good. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Stop. Alright, that's loud enough.
This is the Toboggan. It was made in Preston, Canada, and my parents got it at a secondhand store in the 80s. I've turned it into a mobile recording setup, complete with power, an interface, a laptop running Pro Tools, and my pedal board. The last pedal on the board splits the signal. One line goes direct to the interface to be recorded, and the other line goes to this 100-watt Marshall half stack and can be toggled on and off with my foot, while the direct line keeps recording. So, if I drag the Toboggan out in front of this 100-watt Marshall half stack with all the knobs on 10, and the sound of the amp in the room vibrates my guitar in a way that changes the tone, then it should be easy to hear that difference in the direct signal coming out of my guitar as I toggle the amp sound on and off. If you can't hear a change in the direct sound when the amp starts and stops making noise, then the sound in the room vibrating the guitar differently must not affect the tone. The Toboggan, by the way, is sponsored by my PayPal email address. I've been doing all this by myself without sponsorships or affiliations because the goal is to just go in not knowing what's going to happen, do the work, and then see what happens. If you like what I've been doing and you want to help me figure out where the tone comes from in pickups or speakers or microphones or even acoustic guitars, then throw me a couple bucks and I'll keep working on it. So, this is the sound the camera picked up. And this is the direct sound out of the guitar. Unless you're purposely trying to make feedback happen, it seems like the only way the sound in the room can affect an electric guitar's tone is psychological. When I get to turn up loud and hear myself loud, it makes me feel more important, and that probably makes me more confident in my decision making. I think this might be why my friends thought it was so important to have the feel of an amp in the room. But I also know that every guitar player I look up to gets great tone and makes confident choices with their cab off in another room entirely, and a pair of headphones being the only thing getting their guitar into their ears, which of course is the sound the microphone's picking up. Maybe overcoming the psychological crutch of hearing yourself loud in the room and being able to deliver a great performance with great tone into a microphone, regardless of what the in-the-room sound is like, is part of becoming a better guitar player. But based on the evidence I've seen, here's the one thing every influential guitar tone has in common. Every influential guitar tone was and is made up of a chain, starting with the player's decisions in their brain, execution with their hands, the pick, strings, guitar, pickup, cables, effects, amp, cab, and speaker. But then it doesn't stop there with the sound you hear in the room. It continues to the microphone, mic placement, and then into the world of the mix engineer where it's balanced with everything else and committed as the tone that the rest of the world will hear. That is how every tone we've ever loved got into our ears. The only way to evaluate your own guitar tone is to get a microphone and an interface and record it, because listening to your amp in the room is objectively an entirely temporary and purely recreational activity, and that's fine, but it can't be replicated, compared, or used as evidence in support of or in opposition to anything in any way, regardless of how often you do it or how long you've done it. And the best part about this is it isn't just some guy's opinion, because it's not an opinion. Send me your favorite unrecorded guitar tone if you disagree. So as far as the chain goes, all of these things are necessary, and some make a big difference and some make a small difference. I'm doing my best to help figure out which things make a big difference and which things make a small difference with actual audio comparisons anyone can listen to, so we can all focus on how to get the tone we want, and I hope you join me in the future for more videos.